For 6.5 years, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission heard from survivors of residential schools. Today in studio with one of the commissioners, Marie Wilson. So wonderful to have you here today, Marie.
It's great to be here, Jamie. Thank you.
I learned a lot from reading your new book called North of Nowhere, Song of a Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner, which is a very, very powerful read about you and about your experiences. One of the things I did not know was that you had to apply for the job to be a commissioner. Tell me about that.
Well, it was, some people may remember the longer history of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is that we had a group of commissioners that started in 2008, and for a variety of reasons that didn't hold. So there was a second call that went out, and for me, I was very aware of the importance of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but at the time of the first one, there were a bunch of personal reasons why the timing was not right for me. The second time, I asked around and was asked by others to find out what the process would be, and it was an application process, actually. Some people were referred and some people were nominated, but there was a really big selection committee by people who had been involved in this massive court case, which was initiated by survivors of the residential schools. So I applied for the job, as simply put as that. I was interviewed among hundreds of people, apparently, by a representative of the Supreme Court of Canada, by a representative of the Government of Canada, by 4 of our national churches, by the head of the Assembly of First Nations at the time, the head of Inuit Tapiri Kanatami, the national Indigenous organizations. And I always say, lucky for me, I was selected to serve. I wanted to apply because I cared about the issue. My husband is a residential school survivor. I live in the Northwest Territories and have for almost 50 years now, where per capita, more people have been affected by the residential school story than anywhere else in the country. I have children and grandchildren who are inheritors of that history, as so many tens and hundreds of thousands of children in this country are. And I had lived a kind of life that I would say is typical of most Canadians as a non-Indigenous person, which was to say I grew up in southwestern Ontario in complete ignorance of the residential school story, and was raised in one of the churches that ran residential schools without my ever knowing that. So I thought the combination of all those things and the professional experiences and skills that I had, I guess I would say absorbed over the years of my career in journalism and in teaching, were worthwhile things to at least offer, and I had some perspectives that I thought were valuable. And so I put it forward, and lucky for me, I was selected to be one of the 3 commissioners.
And those commissioners, of course, Chief Wilton Littlechild and also Marie Sinclair, who we lost recently. Despite all of those credentials, in your own home, there was a debate, should it be you or should it be your husband, Stephen, who is a former premier of the Northwest Territories?
Yes, we did talk about it because we really wanted the commission to succeed. And of course the debate partly was, should we both apply? Should one of us apply? Should the other apply? Will we cancel each other out? Will we double our chances? We didn't know how to interpret that, and we knew that in the end, those in charge of making a choice would want to have a complement of commissioners. It was articulated that there would be 3. So they would want to have a team that was complementary to itself and to each other. And so we didn't know what the other factors would be. But in the end, my husband, who is also a residential school survivor, he was the one who said, I think you should apply because, as he said, I think you would be able to handle it better than I could. He was concerned for his own unresolved childhood memories and all the triggers that would be there for him, and he wasn't sure that he would be able to bear it.
Yeah, and when you found out, of course, you called your husband to let him know, and having read your book, his statement rings very, very loudly when he just essentially said, make sure they understand what happened.
Well, what he said, the exact wording was, make sure they understand the enormity of it. And it was really actually prophetic, because the truth is none of us, not one of us as a commissioner, none of the health supports, and even communities themselves, I don't think people had realized the enormity of it, because there had been such a cone of silence around it all, and so many people had buried their history, had taken on personally their feelings of they were the only one, or it only happened to me, or maybe I really was bad, that's why bad things happened to me in that school. But also there was just so much pain for people to remember it and to talk about it. And so as a result, and cover that, of course, by the fact that not one of us was taught about it in school of our generation, that there was this massive ignorance about it all. And so who would know the enormity of it until the floodgates opened and it started unfolding?
And they did unfold. There were 7 national events, certainly conversations. You crisscrossed the country with the other commissioners listening to survivor stories, more than 7,000 survivor stories. You write in your book, sometimes there'd be 4 or 5 survivors who would have signed up. And once they started to talk, others in the room would join, and it just kept coming. It had to have been emotionally draining to hear these stories day after day.
But you know, Jamie, it was, yes, it was, but it was also day after day uplifting in that sort of internal contradictory way. Because when you have 4 people signed up to speak, and then you see other people coming forward, you realize how much courage it takes for the 4, and how much encouragement comes along with their example, the inspiration of, if they could talk, I could talk. If they have something to say, I too can share what I have to say. And you would see, because people would tell you, that finally letting it out, setting it down, was such a liberation. And for many, it was the beginning of a long and hard healing journey. And for many others, it was kind of a culmination of a personal healing journey they had already been on in their own ways. So it was uplifting in that way to realize that even on the level of individuals and individual families, as people told things and shared things with their family members that they had never talked about before, you could see that there was a liberation coming along with that. Doesn't mean people walked in, hurt and walked out healed. Doesn't mean that. But it means that it moved the dial on the big work that people were involved in. And it allowed suddenly for, especially children, especially the intergenerational survivors, to have a better understanding, for many of them, why things were the way they were, why families had been the way they had been, why this or that parent or grandparent or whatever was present or not present in their lives. I think it helped people to see things differently, with less anger. I talk about that in the book, and more compassion and more understanding. So I think it did contribute towards the big healing work that is still underway.
Not surprisingly, as a journalist, you took copious notes. You provide a lot of commentary in your book through the survivors' words. You've captured them. There are so many stories that you heard. Is there 1, 2 that stand out, that really grabbed you during those hearings and listening to those stories?
Well, first of all, let me just clarify, I actually don't provide any commentary. I was very careful with that. I did not want to speak for survivors, and I did not want to play around with people's words. What I tried to do was offer, through the pages of my book, one more place, one more platform where they could speak for themselves, because it's their words that I'm sharing, right. Not my take on their words. What I talk about that is mine is my response to what I was hearing, what I was living and experiencing. But it really is not about a commentary. I do offer some thoughts that are more towards commentary about our country and the big work that is still before us, but not about the survivors. In terms of what stands out, I can tell you this, that in every single hearing, and apart from the big 7, we were in hundreds of communities. We were probably in somewhere between 200 and 300 smaller community events, in addition to those 7 big events, and in addition to a very big opening event and a very big closing event. And in every single hearing, in every single community hall, there were stories that stood out and that were so overwhelming, either overwhelmingly devastating or overwhelmingly beautiful and triumphant. There was always something. So I can't say that one stood out. What I have tried to share in the book, though, because you don't know down the road which stories are going to still live with you and which ones are going to come to the surface. And when I was in the practice of writing the book and starting off every day with a quiet meditation and waiting to see what would come, it was really fascinating to see which stories surfaced. And the way I've tried to tell the story is a way that makes the whole country aware that this belongs to all of us, this story. So I traveled the journey of the TRC across all the regions of Canada. And there is an individual story or more in every single region that I lift up and talk about. I hope people will find compelling stories in each and every one of them. But I reflect at the end that the stories that stand out for me in a way, as much as what was happening on the road, were the stories that I was experiencing when I came back home. And I share two very personal stories of moments with my granddaughters in one scene and with my grandsons in another scene. And they stand out for me by way of contrast, by way of how it is when you have little children in a situation where they are loved and protected and cared for and educated and who have no doubts about who they are, how that contrasts when you have a roundup of kids that are completely depersonalized, given numbers in many cases instead of their names, not celebrated their birthdays or anything else that individualizes them, and then unprotected and open to abuses of all kinds. That contrast, that's what really stands out for me, because it is the takeaway, one of the most important takeaway lessons of all, is that we need to love and protect and care for our children, and we need to be investing in this new generation, in the generation that is in our midst, so that they are not growing up to first of all, be crippled and damaged in the way that we did that with so many previous generations over the course of more than a century. And at the same time, so we don't have a whole generation of adults that have to spend their adulthood saying they're sorry for everything that they did wrong and that they should have done and didn't do. We need to do far better for all of our children.
We're speaking with Marie Wilson, one of the 3 commissioners for Canada's National Truth and Reconciliation Commission, about her new book, North of Nowhere. And we'll be back right after this. Welcome back to In Conversation with Marie Wilson of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Just reading from your book, Marie, this is one paragraph late in the book where it's talking about the bringing together of multiple parties that were all in some way involved in the history, the difficult history of the residential schools. And you write, these parties did not all come easily or willingly to this reckoning in Canadian history. Some of them had to be dragged through court more than once to get here. But in seeing them all together, I thought that if Canada was now able to stand back from itself, to appreciate the value of what had happened since and how it unfolded, we might begin to see beyond our national shame to a country with a courageous model to offer other nations seeking truth and redress. It's pretty clear what you're saying there, but it was a 6.5-year journey. That was the work of the commission, and now you're at this point. Tell me more.
Well, we were at that point in the commission, but the work began before our commission, and it really began with the survivors, who, 80,000 of them at the time, who had no voice and no rights, including the right to vote, basic democratic rights, when they were all young children in those schools, nor did their parents. until 1960 in this country. And once adults, they started coming together in small groups and then bigger groups and eventually in very vocal court cases to say what happened to us as children is not right. It's not right, and someone needs to be held to account. And so they were the ones that really forced the creation of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they forced it by taking the federal government and all of these churches to court. And that is why seeing them all standing together, those who were the defendants, but also those who were the protagonists who brought the court case, all standing together, the national chief of the Assembly of First Nations and the president of the Inuit Tapiri Kanatami, and there they all were, and this was towards our closing event. And you're sort of thinking, how many times in our history have we been kicking and screaming to the right answer if we had just been able to stand back from ourselves and say, what would be the right thing to do? What would be the just thing to do based on the values that we proclaim for our country? And yet here we were, having done this huge work we made it very public. We made it free to everyone. We invited everyone in. We wanted the media to play a big role. And we all learned from the experience and from each other and from being together in rooms where so many had never been in shared rooms before. And that's what I was really reflecting on, is to say, you know, if we could just, instead of feeling like, oh, that big obligation is over, if we could say, that was extraordinary. Look what we've learned from that experience. Look how we have opened ourselves up and how we have declared our intention to move forward differently. That if we actually do that and not just talk about it, what a good example we could be to other countries and around the world where people are struggling with truth and reconciliation journeys and needs for national healing. Look at the state of our world right now and how polarized we have become and are increasingly becoming. And where will be the middle ground for us to talk about things or even to talk to each other or hear each other? I think this was an extraordinary thing, and it's not to the credit of the government or the churches. On the contrary, it was the survivors who saw a pathway forward, who created an opportunity, and who invited everybody in. And that's the part that I think is truly worth looking at as lessons to be learned much more widely than just the commission itself.
From day one, when you and Chief Wilton, Little Child, and Marie Sinclair got together, do no harm was important as you embarked on this work.
And you know what? It was written right into our mandate. We all agreed, fortunately, we all agreed on the issues of principle and quickly. There was no debate about those things. But it was also prescribed right in our mandate, which we did not write. We had to interpret it as to how we will go about our work. But in terms of what we needed to do and the principles that were supposed to guide our work, it said right there, do no harm. So you have to make choices around that, you know. One of the things that was a critical part of our work was the presence of very skilled health supports, and enough of them to take care not only of the survivors, but as it turned out, to take care of everyone who showed up. And that's one of the things we had to adjust along the way, is to say we're going to need more health supports because this is hard work, and people need to be well supported and to feel like they're going to be okay. Do no harm. And I think it was also true, it became an unwritten code between us and among us as commissioners. You know, we would keep an eye on each other. We would become very familiar with each other's backstories. And we would know if something had been said that might be a trigger to one or the other of us because of what our own experiences had been. We would know when to call a break or when to say, maybe that's enough for today, or to say, gee, I better call so-and-so and check in. You know, that was all part of that do no harm. It was meant to be a healing journey, not a harming journey. And we had to stay very attentive to that.
For the three of you, the three commissioners, you were on the road a lot, away from family. You had healing teams, yes, but it still had to be lonely and it had to be emotionally draining. And yet at times, you found space to laugh, to have levity. You write some great stories about one time, driving with Chief Littlechild and having to pull over to the side of the road because you were laughing so hard. Those must have been special moments, the friendships that were created among the commissioners.
Yeah, it was profound. And some of the best ones didn't even survive the final cut of the book. It was just too long. But there were more funny stories there. And it wasn't just us. It wasn't just the three of us. Sometimes you would see, here would be a former student before you sharing their experiences from school and describing horrific things that had happened to them, and then they would crack you up and crack up the whole room with some funny story of some prank they had pulled or some trick they had pulled on some teacher or something they had done with their res school family, as they called each other often. And I think it's that understanding, which I don't think is unique to Indigenous people, but it's very present, is that laughter is such huge medicine. Sometimes we call it black humor, don't we? I mean, we're talking about laughing in dire circumstances. I'm sure people who are on the front lines of battle found ways to laugh at things, because you have to take care of yourselves with whatever's available. And sometimes laughter is just one of those things that's available, and something that isn't funny becomes funny. Or you just had to be there because you just had to let it out. That valve had to open and you just had to laugh because you had to let some of it out.
It was obviously a special relationship. You can't work with someone for 6.5 years on this type of subject material and not become close. Recently, we lost Marie Sinclair. That had to be a jolt for you.
It was hugely for me personally, but for a much wider family and a much wider country as well. As a commissioner team, I was saying to someone earlier today, it kind of feels like we've lost one of the legs of a three-legged stool. And I'm looking at this stool here, but I was also saying to some young people who were talking to me about this a few days ago, when you look at such an enormous whole, part of it is that Murray was so high profile and so accomplished, for sure, because of his unique skills and abilities and talents and achievements. Also, because he was the first in so many ways. He was the first in so many measures. And the reason I say that is because I think as much as we feel the loss, and I have felt deep sadness along with everyone else, I've had to deal with that, but we also have to not be discouraged by that, because we have to realize, all right then, if he was the first, who will be the next and the next and the next? And to really turn to the next generation and the younger generation to say, there's ongoing work to be done for sure. There are built-in responsibilities there, and there will be other great people to come along, and we have to create circumstances that will allow for them also to be nurtured and supported and given opportunity to shine.
In his opening statements, when the Commission wrapped up its work and released its 94 calls to action, Marie Sinclair was very, very clear, and he said it to the country. He said, this amounts to cultural genocide, what happened in these residential schools. It caught the country's attention, probably like it hasn't been caught previously, because this was not talked about. How do you feel now, a few years removed from the Commission's work? How are we doing as a country on those 94 calls to action?
Well, first of all, I agree with the description. I mean, we talked about that at length as commissioners and felt that that was an important first statement for him to give. How I feel is that I am too impatient for my own good. That there are good things happening. I was on a call with a group of Indigenous leaders just this very morning that are doing extraordinary work at their community level and who are working with national and international level corporate supporters who want to engage and want to know how they can be supportive and how they can help. And those things would not have been happening 15 years ago. So there is progress. It's not all up to the government to do things, and the government may or may not be doing things as fast as we would all like. But it doesn't mean that things aren't happening, and it doesn't mean that some things have not been done. It means there's a lot of work left to do. And one of the things that Marie said in that closing speech, and we've repeated it, each of us in our own way, many times over the course of the commission, is when you have residential schools that are in place for almost 150 years that predate Confederation itself, you can't expect in a couple of years to snap out of it through using the word reconciliation here and there. It's long, hard work. You can't turn that around that fast. But you have to work at it, and you have to keep working at it, and you have to not let up on working on it, and you have to call in all the partners and helpers that you can so that the work continues. And I think that's where we are. I think it's very important that we do lift up and celebrate not as in celebration, but as in appreciation, those good things that are being done. You're going to be talking about all of this, and already are, at Algonquin College here. There are universities and campuses all over the country that have reconciliation strategic plans. There's course curriculum that has been changed in faculties, both at college and university level and at high school level, in various parts of the country. It's not everywhere yet. It's not saturated yet, but it's far more so than was ever there before. And those young people who are learning those things are going to know things that the adult population that I have been part of did not know and had to learn as adult learners. And that adds up to a shift. Slowly but surely that adds up to a cultural shift and a different way of looking at each other and talking to and about each other. And I hold great hope in that. And we all have to keep up the work.
It's good to end this interview with hope. Marie Wilson, it's a terrific book, North of Nowhere, Song of a Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner. Thank you for coming in.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on In Conversation With.